A black boy helped a millionaire change a flat tire, asking for nothing in return. The next day, a black SUV appeared in front of his house, and what happened next moved the entire neighborhood. David sat behind the wheel of his SUV, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. The road stretched out in front of him, empty, flanked by tall grass swaying in the summer heat. He looked at his watch, muttering under his breath. He had a meeting in less than an hour, an important one. But as the car sped along the narrow rural road, there came a jarring bump, followed by the unmistakable thump, thump, thump of a flat tire. "Of course. Just perfect," he said, his voice dripping with frustration. He sighed, pulling over to the side of the road, his luxury vehicle kicking up a cloud of dust. The heat hit him as soon as he stepped out, and he winced, adjusting his suit jacket and loosening his tie. David knelt beside the tire. It was clearly shredded, pieces of rubber peeling away. He glanced down the empty road and back at his phone. No signal. He cursed under his breath, tucking the phone back into his pocket. He stared at the tire, feeling helpless. He'd never had to change one himself before. In his world, someone always handled these kinds of issues. Assistants, chauffeurs, service crews. But out here on this deserted road with no cell signal, there was no one. Just him, his broken-down SUV, and the sweltering heat. David's thoughts drifted back reluctantly. A long time ago, when he was a young man, he'd been in a similar situation, stranded and needing help. He remembered the faces of the people who ignored him then, who looked the other way. It left a bitter taste, a reason he hated relying on others. He shook his head, shoving the memory aside. The sun beat down harder, the road shimmered in the distance, and the tension in his chest grew. The sky above was clear, and the nearest sign of civilization seemed far away. He needed to find a solution before the day turned into dusk. Suddenly, David squinted. Something, or rather someone, was moving towards him, a silhouette on the horizon getting closer. He straightened up, trying to make out the figure. It was a kid, no more than 14, wearing a faded t-shirt and a pair of old sneakers. As the boy got closer, David could see his determined expression. "Hey, mister, got trouble with your car?" the boy called out, stopping a few steps away from the SUV. He was looking right at David, his eyes clear and curious. David hesitated. He felt a strange mix of relief and caution. "Yeah, flat tire," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "And I don't exactly know how to fix it." The boy nodded, moving closer. He glanced at the shredded rubber and then at David. "I can do it. My dad showed me how." He dropped to his knees, inspecting the tire. "Got a spare?" David frowned. Wait, you can really do it?" He stared at the boy. He seemed sure of himself, but David wasn't used to relying on strangers, much less a kid. The boy looked up, smiled slightly. "Yeah, it's just a tire, mister. No big deal." He stood up, dusting his knees off. "The spare is usually under the back. Mind if I take a look?" David gave a short nod, feeling uneasy, but also without any other option. He stepped aside, watching as the boy moved confidently to the back of the SUV, opening the hatch. He saw the kid find the tools and the spare, not hesitating for a moment. David stood there, unsure of what to do with his hands. He glanced down at the boy, who had already begun loosening the lug nuts, the wrench moving back and forth with a rhythmic clank. "You're really doing this," David murmured, more to himself. He could feel sweat forming on his back, a combination of the heat and the unease he felt from this situation. The boy worked quickly, ignoring the dirt and the weight of the tire. After some time, he looked up, a bit of sweat dripping down his forehead. "You all right there, mister? You're looking kind of pale." David cleared his throat, straightened his suit jacket. "I'm fine, just not used to this kind of thing." The boy smiled again, and David couldn't help but notice how genuine it was. "It's no problem, really. You just got to know where to look and how to get your hands dirty." David stayed silent, watching as the kid finished attaching the spare tire. He worked quickly, tightening the bolts, and finally stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He took a step back and gave David a thumbs up. "All done." David blinked, almost in disbelief. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He took out a few bills, holding them out to the boy. "Here for your trouble. I appreciate it." The boy shook his head immediately, backing away. Nah, I don't need that. Just wanted to help. You seemed like you could use it. David frowned, holding the money there, his hand hanging awkwardly. No, really, I insist. But the boy just smiled, shook his head again, and started to walk away, waving over his shoulder. Take care, mister. Good luck with wherever you're going. David watched, stunned, as the boy disappeared down the road, the same way he had come. The bills were still in his hand. He stood there for a moment, then let out a long breath. The unease hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown. He wasn't used to this, a simple favor with no expectation of reward. He turned back to the SUV, slipping the money back into his wallet. As he climbed into the driver's seat and started the car, he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, the boy's form getting smaller and smaller until it was gone completely. David drove on, but his thoughts were anything but clear. Something about that encounter wouldn't let him go, a nagging feeling, a sense of being unsettled. He pressed his lips together, focusing on the road ahead, trying to shove the thoughts away. But they stuck with him, long after he left the empty road behind. David's mind wandered as he drove, replaying the entire encounter over and over again. The boy's smile, the way he refused the money, the casual take care he threw over his shoulder. It felt wrong somehow, not the boy's actions but David's own reaction. He wasn't used to not being in control, to not having the power that money brought. He pulled into his driveway, the automatic gates opening as his luxury SUV rumbled through. The house loomed ahead, modern, sleek, the kind of place where everything looked perfect but felt cold. David parked, shutting off the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring blankly out of the windshield. Hey, hun, you're late. David looked up, startled out of his thoughts by his wife, Clara, standing at the door. She was smiling, but her expression shifted slightly as she saw his face. She stepped closer, concern creasing her brow. Everything all right? Yeah, David said quickly, forcing a smile. He grabbed his briefcase and climbed out, shutting the door harder than he meant to. Had some trouble on the road, just a flat. Clara folded her arms, tilting her head. A flat tire? Did you manage to fix it? No. He hesitated, then added, a kid showed up. He fixed it for me. He gave a small shrug, trying to sound casual. Didn't want anything for it. Clara raised an eyebrow. Didn't want anything? Really? David nodded, his expression growing more serious. Refused the money I offered him. Just helped and left. She studied him for a moment. That's kind of amazing, actually. People aren't usually that nice for nothing these days. David just grunted in response, stepping past her into the house. Yeah, well, I guess. He wasn't sure why, but her words irritated him. Maybe it was because she was right. Maybe it was because he knew he would never have done the same. The evening moved on, but the strange feeling refused to leave him. At dinner, he barely touched his food. His two kids, Ellie and Josh, were chattering about their day, but their voices felt distant, muffled. Clara noticed, giving him a sideways glance. All right, what's going on? She asked, leaning her elbows on the table. You've been acting weird since you got home. David looked up, blinking. He shook his head. It's nothing, just... I don't know. He paused, the words almost catching in his throat. It's that kid. I can't stop thinking about it. Ellie, his daughter, looked up from her phone, her curiosity piqued. What kid? David sighed. He set his fork down, leaning back in his chair. I told you. The kid that helped me with the tire. He wouldn't take any money. He just did it, like it was the most normal thing in the world, and then he walked away. He rubbed his forehead, trying to make sense of his own frustration. I don't understand it. Josh, his son, smirked. Maybe he's just a good person, Dad. David shot him a look but didn't respond. Clara watched him carefully, her expression softening. Sometimes people do good things just because they can, David. Not everyone expects something in return. David frowned. Yeah, well, it doesn't make sense to me. Everyone wants something. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a scrape. Anyway, I'm going to get some air. Clara nodded slowly, her eyes following him as he walked out to the backyard. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, looking out at the manicured lawn. He wanted to dismiss it, to forget about the kid and move on. But there was something there, something he couldn't shake. The look in the boy's eyes, the way he just smiled and walked away, as if helping was enough. David went to bed late that night, his thoughts still in disarray. Clara was asleep by the time he finally climbed in beside her. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the nagging sense of incompleteness. It was just a flat tire. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, but somehow it did. The next morning, David woke up with a sense of purpose. Even if he couldn't quite put his finger on why, he had to find the boy. He didn't know what he would say, or even if the kid would be there, but he had to try. He got dressed quickly, throwing on casual clothes instead of his usual suit. Clara looked up from her coffee, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Going somewhere?" David nodded, already heading for the door. "I'm going back, to where I got the flat." Clara blinked. "To find the kid?" "Yeah," David said, pausing at the door. He gave her a quick smile. "Don't wait up for me." He climbed back into the SUV, his mind focused. He remembered the stretch of road, the feeling of helplessness when he first saw the tire was flat. It didn't take long to get there, but the landscape seemed different today, less threatening, more familiar. David slowed the car as he approached the spot. He parked on the side, stepping out and looked around. The sun was already warming the air, and he could feel sweat gathering on his neck. He scanned the distance, his eyes narrowing, and then he saw it, a house, small and worn, standing back from the road. He walked towards it, feeling a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. What if he was wrong? What if it wasn't the boy's house? He shook the thought away, kept walking. The front yard was unkempt, a few rusted toys scattered around. David stopped at the edge of the walkway, taking a deep breath before stepping up to the door. He raised his hand, knocking firmly. There was a rustling from inside, and then the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her eyes widening in surprise. She looked at David, his expensive shoes, the watch on his wrist, the determined look on his face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. David cleared his throat. Yeah, I'm looking for a kid, 14, I think. He helped me with my car yesterday." The woman's expression softened. She nodded slightly. "You mean Lucas?" David nodded. "Yes, Lucas. I wanted to thank him. Properly." The woman stepped back, glancing over her shoulder. "Lucas, come here. Someone's here for you." David heard footsteps, and then Lucas appeared, his eyes widening in recognition. "Oh, hey, mister," he said, a smile breaking across his face. David took a step forward. "Lucas, I wanted to find you. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about what you did for me yesterday. I need to do something for you in return." Lucas shook his head, the smile never leaving his face. "I told you, mister, it was no big deal. I just wanted to help." David looked at him, trying to understand. The sincerity, the kindness, it was so foreign to him. But he knew he couldn't leave it like this. "Please," David said, "there has to be something I can do. For you, for your family." Lucas glanced at his mother, who gave a small nod. He looked back at David, his eyes thoughtful. "Well," he said slowly, "maybe there is one thing." David felt a flicker of hope. "Anything," he said quickly. "Whatever you need." Lucas's smile grew wider. "How about you come in for breakfast? We don't have much, but it'd be nice." David blinked, taken aback. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then nodded. "All right. I'd like that." The door swung open wider, and David stepped inside, feeling something shift within him. He didn't know what it was, but maybe, just maybe, this was a start. David sat at the modest wooden table in Lucas's kitchen. The place was small, tidy, but worn. The scent of coffee and eggs filled the air. Lucas's mother moved around the kitchen preparing breakfast. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not used to being in a setting like this. Everything about it felt alien. Lucas sat across from David, a grin still on his face. "So, what brings you back, really?" Lucas asked, his curiosity evident. David scratched his chin, choosing his words carefully. I couldn't get yesterday out of my mind," he said. He glanced around the kitchen at the simple curtains, the cracked linoleum floor. "You helped me, and I wanted to repay you somehow. It just didn't sit right with me, leaving it like that." Lucas shrugged, taking a sip of his juice. "It's really no big deal. I mean, we're supposed to help each other, right?" David paused. The simplicity of Lucas's words made him feel almost foolish. His entire life had been built on the idea that nothing came for free, that every action had a price, a return, an angle. Yet here was Lucas, treating kindness as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lucas's mom set a plate in front of David, scrambled eggs and toast. "It's not much, but you're welcome to it," she said, offering him a gentle smile. David looked down at the plate, then back up at her. He swallowed, nodding. "Thank you. It's more than enough." They ate in silence for a few moments, the clinking of forks on plates the only sound. David kept glancing at Lucas, the way the boy interacted with his mum, the warmth in his eyes. It was such a stark contrast to the way his own household had felt lately, cold, distant, more like a transaction than a family. Lucas looked up suddenly, his eyes catching David's. "So, what's it like? You know, being successful and all that?" David paused, chewing thoughtfully. "It's busy," he said finally. "A lot of meetings, a lot of responsibility." He looked at Lucas, seeing the curiosity there. "I guess most people think it's all fancy parties and luxury, but it can be pretty lonely." Lucas nodded slowly. "I get that. I mean, people probably see the fancy car and think you've got it all, right?" David smiled slightly, a bitter edge to it. "Yeah, something like that." He looked down at his plate, pushing the eggs around. "Sometimes I think I've lost sight of what really matters, the things that, well, that make life worth it." Lucas tilted his head, considering. "Maybe you just need a reminder." He smiled again, that same open, genuine smile. "Helping someone, being there. It feels good, right?" David blinked, taken aback. He set his fork down, nodding slowly. Yeah, it does." Lucas's mum cleared her throat softly, breaking the moment. "We don't have much, but we try to help when we can. It's how my mum raised me, and it's how I'm raising Lucas." David nodded, glancing at her, then back at Lucas. "You've done a good job," he said, his voice sincere. "Lucas is a good kid." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind David wasn't used to. He leaned back in his chair, letting himself relax for the first time in what felt like a long time. It wasn't about the luxury or the material things. It was just about being there, sharing a meal, connecting. As the meal finished, Lucas stood up, taking David's empty plate and stacking it with his own. "So, what now, mister? You gonna be all right?" he asked, a teasing smile playing on his lips. David let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "I think so. But—" He hesitated, then looked Lucas in the eye. "I really do want to do something for you, for your family. Not because I owe you, but because I want to." Lucas exchanged a look with his mother. She gave a small, encouraging nod. Lucas turned back to David, shrugging. "I mean, we could use a few things around here, but it's not why I helped you." David smiled, feeling a weight lifting off his shoulders. "I understand that, and I want to help anyway." He stood, extending his hand to Lucas's mom. "Thank you for breakfast. It meant more to me than you probably realize." She took his hand, giving it a firm shake. "You're welcome here anytime. Just remember, we don't need fancy gifts. We're just happy to share a meal." David nodded, turning back to Lucas. "I'll be in touch. Maybe we can figure something out, something that's meaningful." Lucas smiled, giving David a thumbs up. "Sure thing, mister. Just come by whenever." David stepped out of the house, the screen door creaking shut behind him. He took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on his face. The road stretched out ahead of him, the same road that had felt so empty just the day before. Today, it felt different, less lonely. He climbed into his SUV, starting the engine. He watched the house for a moment in the rearview mirror before pulling away. The sense of incompleteness was still there, but it was changing. He had begun something today, and maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something better. David drove back home, his thoughts no longer filled with the frustration of the previous day. Instead, he thought about what Lucas had said, about helping for the sake of it. He felt a spark of something, hope, maybe. It was small, but it was there. He pulled into the driveway of his house, the gates closing behind him. As he stepped out, he could see Clara standing by the door, her arms crossed, watching him. There was a question in her eyes, and David smiled, walking up to her. "So?" she asked, her eyebrows raising. "Did you find him?" David nodded, stopping in front of her. "Yeah, I did." He paused, then added, "Had breakfast with them." Clara looked surprised, then smiled. "Breakfast, huh? Sounds like a step in the right direction." David nodded again, his smile growing. "Yeah, I think it was." He glanced back at the car, then at his wife. "And you know what? I think I want to do more, not just for them, but for others too." It felt right. Clara stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "Maybe you're finally seeing what really matters, David." David looked at her, his expression softening. "Maybe I am." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them filled with a new understanding. David knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he had to follow it. And with that thought, he stepped inside, ready to see where this journey would take him next. David woke up the next morning with a determination that surprised even himself. He needed to help Lucas and his family. But more than that, he needed to feel that connection again, that sense of doing something meaningful. He wasn't sure exactly what it was that drove him, but the nagging feeling of incompleteness had evolved into something closer to resolve. After a quick breakfast, David began making calls. He spoke with people he knew in the area where he had been stranded, contacts through business, people who knew the local community well, but the responses were mostly vague. No one really knew the boy he was talking about. David hung up from the last call, frustrated. He leaned back in his office chair, staring at the ceiling. It felt wrong somehow. He had the resources, the power to move mountains if he needed, yet he couldn't track down a kid who had helped him. The disconnect gnawed at him. He shook his head, pushing away from the desk. No, he wasn't giving up that easily. He needed to get out there, to find Lucas in person. The people he had talked to didn't understand. This wasn't just some whim. It was more important than that, even if he couldn't fully articulate why. David grabbed his keys and headed out, telling Clara he'd be back later. She watched him go with a knowing look, simply nodding. She seemed to understand, in that quiet way of hers, that this was something he needed to do for himself. The drive back out to that rural road was quicker this time, though David's mind was anything but settled. His eyes flicked across the fields and houses as he passed, looking for something familiar, looking for that small, worn house where Lucas lived. He drove slowly, his eyes scanning the distance. After some time, David finally saw it, a modest, weathered house standing back from the road, the same place where he'd had breakfast with Lucas. He pulled over, parking his SUV on the gravel shoulder. His heart was pounding, though he couldn't quite understand why. David approached the house, his steps hesitant but resolute. He knocked on the door, the wood creaking beneath his knuckles. It took a moment, but eventually the door opened, and there was Lucas's mom, the same look of surprise crossing her face as before. "Mr. David," she said, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Didn't expect to see you back here so soon." David smiled, nodding. "Yeah, I know. I wanted to talk with Lucas again, if that's all right." She glanced over her shoulder, calling out, "Lucas, come here, Mr. David's back." A few moments later, Lucas appeared, his eyes lighting up when he saw David. He stepped forward, his grin wide. "Hey, mister, you back for another flat tire?" David let out a small laugh, shaking his head. No, nothing like that this time." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I was actually hoping we could talk again. I've been thinking about what you said, about helping people just because, and I want to help you, Lucas. I want to do something meaningful for you and your family." Lucas looked back at his mum, who gave him a slight nod, her expression warm but cautious. He turned back to David, shrugging. "I mean, we don't really need much, mister. We're doing okay." David stepped closer, his voice softening. "I understand that, but I want to do it, Lucas. Not because I owe you or because I have to, but because I want to help. I want to make a difference." Lucas considered this for a moment, then glanced back at his mom. She stepped forward, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "What exactly do you have in mind, Mr. David?" David took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I was thinking, maybe I could help fix up the house a bit. It wouldn't be anything extravagant, but I know I could make it a little more comfortable for all of you. You helped me, Lucas, without expecting anything in return, and this is just my way of doing the same." Lucas's mom exchanged a look with her son, then looked back at David. "We've never been the type to ask for help," she said, her voice even. "But I can see that this means something to you, and it means something to us too, having someone want to help just because." Lucas smiled, nodding. "All right, mister. If you want to help, I guess we could use it. The roof's got a leak and the kitchen could use some work." David felt a smile tug at his lips. He nodded, feeling the weight in his chest lift just a bit. "Thank you, I promise. I'll make this place a bit more comfortable for all of you." Lucas's mom nodded, a small smile appearing. "You're welcome to come by any time, Mr. David. Just don't feel like you have to do it. We're happy as we are." David nodded, a sincere look in his eyes. "I understand, and I promise I'm not doing this out of obligation." He looked at Lucas. "You showed me something I needed to see, and I want to do this." Lucas looked back at David, then smiled. "Well then, mister, let's get started." David returned to his SUV, a sense of purpose filling him as he climbed in. He made a few calls on his way back, contacts in construction, people who could help with repairs. He explained the situation, made arrangements. For once he felt like he was using his resources for something that truly mattered. When David got back home that evening, Clara was waiting in the living room. She looked up from her book, her expression softening as she saw the look on his face. "You found him again?" she asked, her voice quiet. David nodded, his smile small but genuine. "Yeah, I did. And I'm going to help them. Really help them." Clara set the book aside, standing up and crossing the room to him. She rested a hand on his arm, her eyes searching his. "You're doing a good thing, David. It's not about the money, you know that, right?" David met her eyes, his voice steady. "I know. It's about something else, something I didn't know I needed until now." She smiled, her hand squeezing his arm gently. "I'm proud of you." David nodded, feeling something warm and unfamiliar in his chest. Maybe for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that made a difference. It wasn't just about fixing a tire or a house, it was about connecting, about understanding what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. And he knew, as he looked into Clara's eyes, that this was only the beginning. David parked his SUV in front of Lucas's house, the gravel crunching under the tires as he came to a stop. The morning sun was warm, casting a gentle glow over the yard. Today was the first real day of work. He had brought along a small team of workers to start assessing the house for repairs, roofing, plumbing, and a few other fixes that needed attention. He took a deep breath, stepping out of the vehicle, and made his way to the front door. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and Lucas was already standing there, a wide grin on his face. "Hey, mister," Lucas greeted enthusiastically. "Ready to get your hands dirty?" David let out a soft chuckle. "I might leave the heavy lifting to the professionals, but I'm here to help however I can." He looked behind Lucas, seeing his mom in the background, a small smile on her face. "Come in," Lucas said, opening the door wider. "Mom made some coffee. I think you're gonna need it if you're gonna hang around here today." David nodded, stepping inside. The familiarity of the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee, brought back a warmth he wasn't accustomed to. Lucas's mother, Clara, smiled politely from the counter. "Mr. David, nice to see you again. You really didn't have to come yourself today, you know," she said, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. David accepted the mug, giving her a grateful smile. "I wanted to. It's important for me to be part of this, not just give orders and leave it at that." Clara nodded, appreciation evident in her eyes. "Well, we're grateful, and you're welcome here always." She looked past David to the workers who had begun unloading tools outside. "They look ready to get started." David glanced over his shoulder, seeing his small crew getting organized. He nodded and turned back to Lucas. "How about you show me around the place, so we can see what needs the most attention?" Lucas shrugged, still grinning. Sure thing, mister. It's not a mansion like yours, though. There was a teasing glint in his eye. David smiled back. I'm here to make it the best version of itself. Lead the way. Lucas took him through the house, pointing out the areas that needed the most help. The roof had a couple of bad leaks, the kitchen plumbing was unreliable, and there were patches of floor that were worn almost to the point of breaking. David made mental notes, glancing around the rooms. The house might have been small, but it was filled with character. It wasn't just walls and a roof. It was clearly a home filled with love. After their tour, Lucas led David back to the front yard, where the workers had set up a temporary workstation. The men were talking amongst themselves, and one of them, a burly man named Greg, waved David over. All right, boss, we're ready to get started, Greg said. Roof looks like the first thing we need to tackle. David nodded. Let's do it. Just let me know if you need anything. Greg gave him a thumbs up before heading to the truck to gather some supplies. David turned back to Lucas, who was watching with an amused smile. Not used to getting your hands dirty, huh? Lucas teased. David chuckled, shaking his head. No, not really, but it feels good. Different, but good. Lucas nodded, his eyes growing more serious. You know, it really means a lot to us, you doing all this. David looked down at the boy, feeling something tighten in his chest. I should be thanking you, Lucas. You helped me more than you know. Lucas tilted his head, his expression curious. How's that? David hesitated, trying to put his thoughts into words. I've spent a lot of my life, disconnected, I guess, focused on work, on money, on everything that doesn't really matter. Meeting you, it reminded me of what's important. Family, community, helping others. Lucas gave a small smile, looking away for a moment before meeting David's eyes again. You're not so bad, mister. Most people just drive by when they see someone in trouble. David felt a pang of regret. He knew that not long ago he might have been one of those people. He nodded, his voice quiet. I'm trying to be better. Lucas's mum stepped out onto the porch, her hands resting on her hips as she watched the workers. I have to say, I've never seen the place so busy, she said with a laugh. It's a good kind of busy, though. David smiled at her. We'll get everything taken care of, I promise. She nodded, her smile softening. Thank you, Mr. David. You have no idea how much this means to us. David glanced at Lucas, who was watching his mum with a gentle smile. He turned back to Clara. It means a lot to me too. This isn't just about fixing a house, it's about doing something that matters. Clara gave a small nod, understanding in her eyes. We don't need anything fancy, just enough to make it livable. We've been managing fine, but it's nice to have some help. David glanced at the roof, where Greg had started hammering away. I'm not here to change your lives, just to make things a little easier. Lucas stepped forward, touching his mum's arm lightly. We're lucky, aren't we, Mum? Not everyone gets this kind of help. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on her son. We are, Lucas, and we don't take it for granted. David smiled, feeling a sense of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun above. It was strange how quickly he had come to care about this family, how connected he felt to them. He had spent years building walls around himself, hiding behind his success, his money, but here, standing in the yard of this worn-down house, he felt something different, something real. The day went on, the crew working steadily, Lucas helping where he could, carrying tools and handing supplies. David found himself pitching in more than he expected, holding ladders, passing nails, even hammering a few boards into place under Greg's watchful eye. He felt the sweat on his back, the ache in his muscles, and it was good. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a feeling of accomplishment, of genuine effort. As the sun began to set, the crew wrapped up for the day. The roof was patched, and the plumbing in the kitchen had been improved. It wasn't finished, but it was a start. David stood back, watching as Lucas ran inside to test the water, the boys' laughter echoing through the house when the tap worked without a hitch. Clara stepped up beside David, her eyes filled with emotion. You've already made such a difference, Mr. David. I don't know how we can ever thank you. David shook his head, smiling. You don't need to thank me. I'm the one who owes you. And besides, he added, looking at Lucas, who had come back out, grinning ear to ear, I think I'm getting more out of this than you realize. Lucas ran up, stopping in front of David. You're coming back tomorrow, right? There's still a lot to do. David nodded, resting a hand on Lucas's shoulder. Of course, I'm in this till the end. Lucas beamed, and Clara nodded in appreciation. The three of them stood there for a moment, watching the crew pack up, the sense of something meaningful filling the air between them. David knew he had a long way to go, not just in the repairs, but in understanding this new path he was on. But for now, he was content to take it one day at a time, knowing that every nail, every board, every small effort was leading him to something better. David arrived early the next morning, his SUV parked in the usual spot in front of Lucas's house. The crisp morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby field. He looked at the worn house, now with its roof patched and the signs of improvement visible. Today, they were going to continue with the plumbing and begin replacing some of the worn-out floorboards in the living room. He stepped out of the car and saw Lucas sitting on the porch, waiting for him. The boy's face lit up as soon as he saw David. "Hey, mister, you're back," Lucas called, jumping up and running over to meet him. His excitement was contagious, and David couldn't help but smile. "Of course I am," David said, ruffling Lucas's hair. "I told you I'm here until it's all done." Lucas nodded, then lowered his voice slightly, a touch of seriousness in his tone. "You know, Mom keeps saying we don't need all this, but, I think she's really happy you're helping. She doesn't want to say it, but I can tell." David glanced over at the front door, where Clara stood, her eyes on them, a small smile on her face. He nodded at Lucas, his voice equally quiet. "Sometimes it's hard to accept help, even when we need it. I know that feeling." Lucas looked up, his expression thoughtful. "You do?" David paused, then nodded. "Yeah, I spent a lot of my life pushing people away, thinking I could handle everything on my own." He gave Lucas a smile. "But I'm learning thanks to you." Lucas beamed, and they walked together towards the porch where Clara was waiting. She gave David a warm smile, gesturing inside. "Come on in, Mr. David. I made breakfast again. You've got to keep your strength up if you're going to keep up with these boys." David followed her inside, the familiar scent of scrambled eggs and toast filling the air. It was a simple meal, but somehow it had become one of his favorite parts of the day. Sitting down with Lucas and his mom, sharing stories, laughing, it was something he had never really experienced in his own house, despite all the luxuries. They sat around the small kitchen table, Clara serving the plates. She looked at David, her expression soft. "I have to say we've never had anyone do something like this for us. It's overwhelming in a way." David smiled, shaking his head. "It's nothing really. You helped me in a way you don't understand, and I want to do what I can for you." Clara gave a small smile, her eyes misting slightly. She looked away for a moment, then back at David. "We don't need much, Mr. David. Really. Just fixing the roof and the floors. It's already more than we ever expected." David nodded, looking down at his plate. He took a breath, then spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "I know that, and I'm not here to change everything. But I was thinking maybe I could help make things a little better for you, more comfortable." Clara tilted her head, her expression curious. "What do you mean?" David glanced at Lucas, who was watching him intently, then back at Clara. "I want to do more than just patch things up. I want to renovate the house, fix up the kitchen properly, make sure the plumbing works all the time, maybe even give Lucas his own proper room." He paused, then added, "I know it's a lot to offer, but it's something I want to do." Clara blinked, her mouth opening slightly in surprise. "Mr. David, that's more than we could ever ask for." Lucas's eyes were wide, his voice filled with excitement. "Really, mister? You'd do that for us?" David nodded, looking at both of them. "Yes, I want to. This isn't about paying you back. It's about doing something good, something meaningful." He looked directly at Clara. "You've given me something I didn't even know I needed, and I want to give back." Clara swallowed, her eyes glistening. She glanced at Lucas, who was practically bouncing in his seat, then back at David. "I don't know what to say. We've always managed on our own, but I can see that you really mean this." David smiled. "I do. And you don't have to decide right now. Just think about it." Clara looked down at her plate, her hands resting on the table. After a moment, she nodded. "All right. We'll think about it. But I want you to know, we're grateful, Mr. David. We really are." Lucas grinned, looking at David. "I think it'd be amazing, mister. I could finally have a room that doesn't leak when it rains." David chuckled, nodding. "That's the plan, Lucas. We'll make sure you've got a room that's warm and dry." The rest of breakfast went by with laughter and excitement, Lucas talking about all the things he wanted for his room. A new bed, maybe even a desk where he could do his schoolwork. Clara listened quietly, her eyes soft, her smile never fading. After breakfast, David went back outside, meeting with Greg and the rest of the crew. He pulled Greg aside, explaining his new plan for the house, the renovations he wanted to start. Greg nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a big project, boss, but we can handle it. Might take a few weeks." David smiled. "That's fine. I want to make sure it's done right." Greg nodded again, giving him a thumbs up before heading back to the crew to start on the day's work. David stood there for a moment, looking back at the house, watching as Lucas and Clara stepped out onto the porch. Clara waved, her eyes meeting David's. There was something there, something that made David's chest tighten. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. A connection. He hadn't felt that kind of connection in years, not even in his own home. He turned back to the workers, taking a deep breath. Today, they would continue with the plumbing and start on the floors, but soon they would be doing much more. And David knew that this wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about building something new, something meaningful. The day wore on, and David found himself more involved than ever, helping carry tools, holding boards in place, even getting up on the ladder to assist with the roof. Lucas was always nearby, eager to help, his energy infectious. Clara watched from the porch, her eyes following them as they worked. In the late afternoon, as the crew was packing up for the day, Clara approached David. She looked at him, her expression earnest. "Mr. David, I've been thinking about your offer," she began, her voice quiet but steady. David set down the tools he was carrying, giving her his full attention. "And?" Clara took a deep breath, then nodded. "We'd be honored to accept your help. It's not easy for us to take charity, but I can see that this isn't charity to you. It's something more." David smiled, feeling a rush of warmth. "It is. Thank you, Clara. I promise I'll make this house everything you deserve." She smiled back, a tear escaping down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, laughing softly. "Lucas is already planning how he wants his new room to look. You've made him so happy, Mr. David." David looked over at Lucas, who was busy talking with one of the workers, his face filled with excitement. "I think he's made me happy too," David said, his voice sincere. Clara nodded, her eyes meeting his. "You're a good man, Mr. David. You might not have known it before, but you're proving it now." David felt a lump in his throat, nodding. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I'm really trying." They stood there for a moment, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the yard. David looked at the house, then back at Clara. This was the beginning of something new, not just for them, but for him too. A new purpose, a new connection. And as he watched Lucas run up, his eyes bright with joy, David knew that this was the right path. He had spent so much of his life alone, focused on the wrong things, but now he had found something worth holding on to. David stood in front of the now bustling house. The hum of power tools and the clattering of equipment echoed in the yard as the workers settled into their tasks for the day. The renovations had officially started, and the crew was busy tearing out old walls, fixing floorboards, and measuring out new materials. The place was a hive of activity, and David felt something stirring inside him, something that felt a lot like pride. He made his way to the porch, where Clara stood, watching the work unfold. She turned to him as he approached, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's really happening, isn't it?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. "It really is, and it's just the beginning." He looked out at the workers, at Lucas, who was eagerly helping one of the men carry a stack of wooden planks across the yard. David couldn't help but smile. The energy around the house was contagious, hopeful, alive. Clara looked at David, her gaze thoughtful. "I think you've done more than just help with the house, Mr. David," she said softly. "You've given Lucas something to look forward to." David's smile grew a bit softer, his eyes following Lucas. "He's a great kid, Clara. You've done an amazing job raising him." Clara looked down, her cheeks coloring slightly. "We've managed. It's not always been easy, but we do our best." David nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "It shows. He's got a good heart, and that's because of you." She smiled, her eyes misting just a little. "Thank you, Mr. David. That means a lot." David spent the next few hours working alongside the crew. He wasn't much for manual labor, hadn't been for years, but Greg was patient, showing him how to do things, handing him tools, guiding his hands when needed. It felt good to work, to feel the strain in his muscles, to sweat in the heat of the day. It felt real. Lucas, meanwhile, was everywhere, helping carry boards, handing tools to the workers, even sweeping up sawdust when it piled up. His enthusiasm never wavered, and David found himself watching the boy with a mix of admiration and affection. Lucas didn't see the work as a chore. He saw it as a chance to be part of something, to help build something lasting. At one point, Lucas ran up to David, his face flushed from the sun, a wide grin on his face. "Hey, mister, come check this out," he said, tugging on David's sleeve. David followed Lucas to the back of the house, where a small group of workers were installing new windows. The old ones had been cracked, letting in drafts during the winter. Now, they were being replaced with sturdy double-pane glass that would keep the house warm in the colder months. "Pretty cool, right?" Lucas said, his excitement shining in his eyes. "No more cold air coming in during the night." David smiled, nodding. "Yeah, it's great, Lucas. It's going to make a big difference." Lucas nodded, looking up at David, his voice suddenly more serious. "You know, I never thought we'd have anything like this. I mean, Mom always did her best, but this is more than we ever hoped for." David crouched down, resting a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You deserve it, Lucas. You and your mom. And I'm just glad I could help." Lucas smiled, his eyes shining. "You're a good guy, mister. I don't care what you say. You're one of the good ones." David swallowed, feeling a lump form in his throat. He nodded, giving Lucas's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Thanks, kid. That means a lot." As the day wore on, the crew took a break for lunch. Clara brought out sandwiches and lemonade, and everyone gathered around the porch to eat. It was a simple meal, but it felt like a feast. The workers joked and laughed. Lucas chatted animatedly with Greg about the work they were doing, and Clara sat beside David, her eyes filled with a quiet contentment. David looked around, taking it all in. It felt like a family, a real family, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about money, or success, or power. It was about people, about connection, about being part of something bigger than himself. After lunch, the crew got back to work, and David found himself standing with Clara on the porch again, watching as Lucas ran around, his laughter filling the air. Clara looked at David, her eyes thoughtful. "Mr. David, if you don't mind me asking, what made you do all this?" she asked, her voice gentle. David paused, considering her question. He looked at Lucas, then back at Clara. I think it's because I realized I was missing something," he said slowly. "I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking that's what mattered. But meeting Lucas, seeing the way he helped me without expecting anything in return, it made me realize that there's more to life than just money and power." Clara nodded, her eyes softening. "Sometimes it takes something simple to show us what really matters," David smiled. "Yeah. And I think I needed that reminder." They stood there for a moment, the sound of the workers and Lucas's laughter filling the air. David took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew he was on the right path, and he knew that this was only the beginning. The sun began to dip low on the horizon as the crew wrapped up for the day. The workers packed up their tools, Greg giving David a nod before heading out. Clara called Lucas inside to wash up, and David found himself standing alone in the yard, looking at the house. It wasn't finished yet, but it was getting there. And it wasn't just the house that was changing, it was David too. He felt it deep inside, a shift, a new understanding of what really mattered. As he turned to leave, Lucas ran back out, his hair damp from washing up, his face flushed with excitement. "Hey, mister," he called, running up to David. "You're coming back tomorrow, right?" David smiled, nodding. "Of course, Lucas. We've still got a lot to do." Lucas grinned, giving David a thumbs up. "Awesome. I can't wait." David watched as Lucas ran back to the house, waving at him before disappearing inside. He stood there for a moment longer, looking at the house, at the yard, at everything they had built so far. It wasn't just a project. It was a new beginning for all of them. He climbed into his SUV, starting the engine. As he drove away, he felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't felt in years. He knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something that would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And for the first time in a long time, David felt truly hopeful. The next morning, David was up before dawn, sipping coffee at the kitchen table while Clara slept upstairs. The quiet of the house felt different, no longer lonely, but more like a calm before a new adventure. Today was important. The major parts of the renovation were almost done, and David had plans to finish up the work with a gesture that went beyond just fixing things. He pulled up to Lucas's house around 7 a.m., earlier than usual, and the workers were already there, unloading supplies and getting ready to start the day. David stepped out, stretching his shoulders as he scanned the house. The changes were noticeable. The new windows, the repaired roof, the fresh coats of paint, they had transformed the once worn-down place into something full of life again. Lucas bounded out of the house, his face lighting up at the sight of David. "Hey, mister, you're early today." David smiled, nodding. "Wanted to make sure we finish up on time. Today's a big day." Lucas tilted his head, curiosity flashing in his eyes. "What do you mean?" David just smiled. "You'll see." Lucas's mum, Clara, followed him out, tying her hair back as she smiled warmly at David. "Morning, Mr. David. Coffee's brewing if you want a cup." David gave her a grateful nod. "I'd love that, Clara. Thanks." He followed her inside, Lucas trailing behind, still clearly curious about what David had planned. They sat around the kitchen table, the coffee mug steaming between them. Clara looked at David, her expression full of quiet contentment. "I can't believe how far we've come already," she said softly, glancing at the newly installed cabinets in the kitchen. "It feels like a dream." David smiled, taking a sip of his coffee. "You've been a big part of it, Clara. This house, it's not just wood and nails, it's your home, and it's been amazing to be a part of making it better." Lucas beamed, his eyes flicking between his mum and David. "Yeah, Mum's pretty awesome, isn't she?" Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, stop it, Lucas." David smiled, his voice sincere. "He's right. You're pretty amazing, Clara." Clara blushed slightly, looking away for a moment. "Well, thank you, Mr. David. But I think we're all a part of this." After breakfast, David went back outside where Greg and the crew were waiting. Today was about wrapping up the last few touches, painting the exterior, finishing the floor in Lucas's room, and installing some shelves Clara had mentioned needing. The crew worked steadily, Lucas darting from place to place, lending a hand wherever he could. David spent most of the day helping where he was needed, but his mind kept drifting to the surprise he had planned for later. It was something he had been thinking about since they started the renovations, something to show the family how much they meant to him. As the sun began to set, the final touches were made. The house looked transformed, sturdy, colorful, full of warmth. The crew began to pack up, Greg giving David a thumbs up as he headed to the truck. "We're all set, boss. House looks brand new," Greg said with a grin. David nodded, patting Greg on the shoulder. "Thanks for everything, Greg. Couldn't have done this without you and the guys." Greg smiled. "Any time, Mr. David." He waved as he climbed into the truck, and the crew drove off, leaving David standing in front of the newly renovated house with Clara and Lucas. Lucas was practically bouncing on his feet, his excitement palpable. "It looks amazing, mister. I can't believe it's really ours." David turned to him, his smile softening. "I've got one more thing for you, Lucas. For both of you, actually." Clara raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, Mr. David?" David reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. He handed it to Clara, his expression serious but kind. "This is for you. It's not much, but it's something I wanted to do." Clara took the envelope, her hands shaking slightly as she opened it. Inside was a set of documents, neatly folded. Her eyes widened as she scanned the papers, her gaze snapping up to meet David's. "Mr. David, what is this?" David smiled, his voice quiet. "It's a trust fund, for Lucas, so he can go to college one day or use it to follow whatever dreams he has." He glanced at Lucas, who was staring at the papers, his mouth hanging open in shock. "I know it's a lot, and I know you didn't ask for this, but I wanted to do something that could make a real difference for you both." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her voice cracking as she spoke. "Mr. David, I don't know what to say." Lucas looked up at David, his eyes wide. "You mean, this is for me, so I can go to college?" David nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Exactly. You're a bright kid, Lucas. You can do anything you set your mind to, and I want to make sure you have the chance to do just that." Clara wiped at her eyes, her voice thick with emotion. "This is too much, Mr. David. We can't accept this." David shook his head, his expression earnest. "It's not too much, Clara. You and Lucas have given me more than I can ever repay. This is just my way of saying thank you." Lucas stepped forward, wrapping his arms around David in a sudden hug. David blinked, taken aback for a moment, before he hugged the boy back, his heart swelling in his chest. "Thank you, mister," Lucas whispered, his voice muffled. "Thank you so much." David patted Lucas's back, his voice soft. "You're welcome, kid. You deserve it." Clara stepped closer, her eyes glistening as she looked at David. "Thank you, Mr. David. You've changed our lives." David met her gaze, his voice steady. "You've changed mine too, Clara. More than you know." They stood there for a long moment, the sun setting behind them, the house glowing in the golden light. It felt like a moment out of time, something perfect, something real. David knew that this was what he had been searching for all along, not wealth, not success, but connection, purpose, and the chance to make a difference. Lucas finally pulled back, his eyes still shining with tears. He looked at David, his voice full of hope. "So what's next, mister?" David smiled, glancing at Clara before looking back at Lucas. "Well, kid, I think the sky's the limit. Whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go, I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Lucas grinned, nodding. "I want to make a difference too, just like you." David felt a lump in his throat, nodding slowly. "You already are, Lucas. You already are." The three of them stood there looking at the house, at the life they had built together. It wasn't just about the bricks and boards. It was about the bond they had formed, the family they had become. David knew that this was only the beginning, that there were more adventures to come, more chances to make a difference. And as the sun disappeared below the horizon, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging, a sense of hope, and the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The final day of the renovation was here, and the excitement around the house was palpable. David arrived with the first light of dawn, the sky painted in soft oranges and pinks. He parked his SUV and stepped out, breathing in the cool morning air. The sense of anticipation hung over him, a mix of satisfaction and something deeper, something he had never known he needed. He stood in front of the now completed house. It looked completely transformed, almost unrecognizable from the worn-down structure it had been just a few weeks earlier. The walls were freshly painted, the roof repaired, the windows shining in the early sunlight. The porch had been fixed up, the old creaking boards replaced with new, sturdy ones. Lucas burst out of the front door, a smile splitting his face. "Mr. David, it's finished! Come see!" His excitement was infectious, and David felt his own face breaking into a grin. All right, let me see what you've got," David said, following Lucas inside. The interior of the house was warm and welcoming, the newly installed wooden floorboards giving the place a polished, clean feel. The living room, now freshly painted in a soft cream color, had shelves neatly arranged with Clara's few treasured knickknacks, things that spoke of memories and history. Lucas led David through each room, pointing out all the improvements with an air of pride. His own room was the highlight, a space that now felt truly his. The ceiling had been repaired, the leaks finally a thing of the past. Lucas's new bed was in place, complete with bright, cheerful bedding, and a small wooden desk sat in the corner by the window. "Look," Lucas said, practically bouncing as he pointed to the desk. "Now I've got a place to do my homework, and it doesn't leak on my bed anymore." David smiled, his chest tightening at the pure joy in Lucas's voice. "You deserve it, Lucas. You deserve every bit of it." Clara came in from the kitchen, her eyes bright as she looked around. "It's really done, isn't it?" she said softly, almost as if she couldn't believe it. David nodded, his voice equally soft. "It's done, Clara, and it's all yours." She stepped closer, her eyes welling up. "Mr. David, I can't even begin to thank you. You've given us more than just a house. You've given us hope, a future." David felt a lump form in his throat, and he reached out, taking her hand. "No thanks necessary, Clara. You and Lucas gave me something I'd lost a long time ago, a sense of purpose. You gave me a family." Clara wiped at her eyes, smiling through her tears. "You're part of our family now, Mr. David, and you always will be." David nodded, his heart full. "I'd like that very much." They moved back out to the porch, where Lucas was already standing, looking out at the road. He turned to them, his face serious for once. "You know, Mum, Mr. David, I've been thinking," he started, his voice steady. David raised an eyebrow, glancing at Clara. "What's that, Lucas?" Lucas took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what I want to do, you know, when I grow up." He looked directly at David, his expression filled with determination. "I want to help people, like you helped us. I want to make things better for people who need it." David's heart swelled with pride. He stepped forward, resting a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You're going to do great things, Lucas. I have no doubt about that. And you know what? You already have a head start. You've been helping since the first day I met you." Lucas smiled, his eyes glistening. "I guess so, but I want to do more. I want to make a real difference." Clara reached out, wrapping her arm around Lucas's shoulders. "And you will, honey. Whatever you set your mind to, you can do." David nodded, his eyes meeting Clara's. "And you'll have all the support you need. From me, from your mum, from everyone who knows how special you are." Lucas looked up at David, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks, mister. You've changed everything for us." David shook his head, smiling. "No, Lucas, you changed everything for me. You reminded me of what really matters." They stood there in the morning light, the air filled with a quiet sense of completion. It wasn't just about the house or the renovations. It was about the relationships they had built, the bond that had formed between them. David knew that he had come here to repay a favor, but what he had found was something far beyond that. He had found a purpose, a connection, and a family, and he knew that this was only the beginning. As the day went on, the neighbors began to stop by, drawn by the sight of the newly renovated house. They brought food, congratulated Clara and Lucas, and admired the changes. The sense of community that had started to form was tangible, and David felt like a part of something bigger, something that truly mattered. Clara invited everyone inside, and soon the house was filled with laughter, the kitchen table laden with dishes brought by neighbors, the voices blending together in a warm symphony. David stood back, leaning against the wall, watching as Lucas chatted animatedly with one of the kids from down the road, his eyes bright with excitement. Clara moved through the crowd, eventually making her way to David. She handed him a glass of lemonade, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know if I ever told you this, Mr. David," she began, her voice low, "but when you first showed up here, I wasn't sure what to think. I thought maybe you were just some rich man trying to feel good about himself." David raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at his lips. "And now?" Clara smiled, her eyes misting over. "Now I know that you're a part of us, your family, and we're so grateful to have you in our lives." David swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding slowly. I'm grateful too, Clara. More than you know. They stood there for a moment, watching as Lucas laughed, his joy filling the room. David knew that this was what it was all about. Not wealth, not power, not success. It was about love, about family, about making a difference in the lives of those who mattered most. As the sun began to set, the gathering started to wind down, the neighbors saying their goodbyes, the laughter fading into the quiet of the evening. David stood on the porch, watching as the last car drove away, the yard once again peaceful. Lucas came out, standing beside David, his eyes on the horizon. "Hey, mister," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for everything." David rested a hand on Lucas's shoulder, his voice equally soft. "You're welcome, kid. But remember, this is just the beginning. There's a lot more to come." Lucas looked up at him, his eyes shining. "I know, and I'm ready." David smiled, nodding. "Me too." They stood there for a long time, watching the sky darken, the stars beginning to appear, the warmth of the day still lingering in the air. David knew that this was where he belonged. Not in a boardroom, not in a luxury car, but here, with Lucas, with Clara, with people who had shown him what truly mattered. It wasn't about repaying a debt. It was about love, about family, about gratitude. And David knew without a doubt that this was the beginning of something beautiful. A new chapter, not just for Lucas and Clara, but for himself. A chapter filled with hope, connection, and the knowledge that they would always have each other, no matter what. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, David looked down at Lucas, smiling. "Let's go inside, kid. We've got a lot of dreams to start working on." Lucas grinned, nodding. "Yeah, let's go, mister." And together, they stepped back into the warmth of their home, ready for whatever came next.